So my name is David Gorton. I'm a program manager for Ping Identity. What that means is I spend a lot of time talking about our infrastructure products, which is Ping Federate and Ping Access. I do have one slide about product, but it's at the very end. Hopefully you'll still be awake for that. Otherwise, what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about is actually a continuation to what Travis talked about. Talking about standards, specifically on how to bring identity into your APIs. The reason why we need to do this, it really comes down to kind of that analogy that Andreas used at the beginning, is when you're building your application, you're building your APIs, it's really like your house. And there are two things that you need to determine about who comes into your house. First off, you need to identify who that is. And in his example, he actually had a couple levels. He had your family, he had your neighbors, and he had the public. Authentication is really about determining who within your family can come into your house, what their name is, whether it's your son or your wife or your spouse, and identifying that person and saying, okay, this person is who they say they are. That's really what authentication is all about. Of course, if we extend that, you can go and look at your neighbors, and you're able to look at your neighbors and physically identify who they are. You need to be able to do the same thing with your APIs, to be able to identify who that user is so that they can come into your house. The next aspect that identity brings is really about access control. We call it authorization. And it's the second step of after you authenticate that user, after you identify who they are, you have to determine what they can do. Travis talked a lot about scopes and using scopes for that authorization and for that level of access control. But ultimately, it comes down to determining where within your house a specific user can go. So if we take, for example, the neighbor, your family, or we'll start with your family. Basically, you trust your family. They probably live in the house with you, so they can go anywhere that they want in the house. They can pretty much do anything that the house provides. But you don't necessarily want to give the same level of access to your neighbor. You really want to be able to restrict your neighbor to really coming into the living room, maybe going into the kitchen, doing some things like that. And that's really about being able to control the access based on who they are, based on their identity. Now, the second thing that's happening as we look out into the industry and into APIs is really that we have identities are exploding everywhere. And this is especially true around consumer services. So every time you go and you sign up, you download a new app onto your phone, you sign up for that service, you've actually created a new representation of your identity out within their services, within their APIs. Our goal is actually to reduce that, and especially when we start talking about private and partner-based APIs, we really want to reduce the number of identities that are out there accessing those different APIs. So that really leads us into this concept that enterprise APIs, or APIs that are really targeted towards that internal user or to that partner user, are the same as what you would see with consumer APIs or public APIs, but they're different. And we'll walk through what that looks like. First off, when you're looking at those public APIs, you go and you develop your APIs, you create what's called a directory, and that's what that circle is that's your directory. That's where you're going to store all of your user information. And then you lay down a security layer on top of that for authentication and for access control or authorization. And you release it, your users come and they sign up, and in essence you create a new identity for them within that directory. So that's great for public APIs, because in a lot of those public APIs you're actually not necessarily charging your users, you're actually taking their identities and using their identities to generate revenue. Facebook is a great example. None of us pay for a Facebook service, but they're using our identities to generate revenue and to make money. So they want to own those identities, and it makes sense for their business. But when we start looking at business-to-business APIs, we're actually not, you don't necessarily want to be in the business of managing those identities, because you're not going to turn around and sell your partner's identities or sell information about your partner to somebody else. Instead, your partner is probably leveraging the information that you are providing to them through the APIs to make more money or to bring business to you. And so the revenue models are a little bit different. But ultimately, when you look at the architecture is really very similar in that you have your APIs, you have a directory. Directory is going to be used a little bit different this time, though, because when you're talking about your APIs, you're probably going to have internal users within your own company that are going to be using this as well. And then, of course, you lay down that security layer. Now, the difference really comes in where those identities live. As you start to bring in your partners, your customers, and you get them to start to use those APIs, they actually have a whole set of identities located out in a directory already that you don't want to force them to create new identities to access your APIs. This is really where federation comes in, and being able to leverage federation for authenticating your partners and your customers to get access to your APIs. Of course, the other thing to notice is your directory now is filling up with your internal users as well. And so you now have your internal users that are authenticating and getting access into your APIs. You also have your partners and your customers who are authenticating where their identities live to come and get access to your APIs. The other thing that you need beyond the authentication, beyond authorization, is as well a fairly robust auditing framework. And really that comes into as you start to record what your partners and what your customers are doing within your APIs. You need to be able to show compliance with certain regulations and be able to record what's happening there. Of course, like I said, the goal is to reuse the identities with standards. The first off, it increases adoption with your partners, with your customers, because they don't have to go through a registration process. They don't have to go through what we call provisioning. And that is, in essence, creating a local user within your system. They can use identities that they already have. They can use their username and password that they authenticate with into their network, into their domain, into their current applications. They can just reuse that and get access to your APIs. The other thing it does is it starts to reduce risk. So when you're building an API for your partners and you bring your partner identities in, when your partner has an employee that leaves, it's actually on you to go and terminate that employee within your system as well. So now from a partner perspective, they go through and they terminate or they remove that identity out of their directory. Then they have to contact you and say, hey, can you go and remove this guy from your directory as well? And so it becomes this kind of maintenance nightmare that actually exposes to a lot of risk because very often that conversation never happens. So you end up with zombie users that continue to live on within the system and actually open up vulnerabilities to that employee that has left can come back into your system and start to use it without necessarily having the access that they should. Of course, as we heard, there's great interoperability. It goes back to that Lego block example that when you're using standards, it's like Legos, and you can just start to put them together very, very easily because they're designed to fit together. And as well as flexibility. So as you get dissatisfied with a system, because you're based in standards, you can actually pull components out and put new components in. So as your system changes, as it grows, you can have the flexibility to pull the components in that meet your business needs the most. Now, of course, the standards that are available, as Travis mentioned earlier, he really talked about OAuth, he talked about OpenID Connect, but there's a third one that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about, and that's SAML. OAuth is really around that delegated authorization, so which we'll talk about here in a minute. It's really that the resource owner can grant access to a specific client. SAML is all about federation, and really what federation is delegating the authentication process to an organization of where those identities live. And so you're going to hear some terms here. One is an identity provider. That's the organization that owns the identities. The other one is a service provider, and that is really the organization that's providing the APIs. And then with OpenID Connect really brings both of those capabilities together into one standard. Now talking about OAuth, like we said, it's really written for API clients to securely interact with APIs on behalf of users. That's where that delegated authorization comes in, is you have an API client acting on behalf of a user. From our perspective, the authorization server runs the show. It's responsible for authenticating a user and then ultimately issuing a token, an OAuth access token, with a specific scope. And that scope really represents, like Travis mentioned, it represents a set of functionality. That could be read access, it could be write access. It could also represent a role, so like an administrator. And then your client can act on behalf based on that functionality. And of course, if you go and you read the standard, I'm sure you guys love to read standards. I actually do. There are multiple flows within there that you can select based on the levels of trust between kind of the three entities, based on the user to the client, and then the client to the resource. And then also kind of the third leg of that triangle is the user to the resource. And so there are a number of profiles in there that you can select based on the use case that you need to solve for. Now, a typical use case, again, I also like swim lane diagrams, so you read the spec, inevitably a swim lane diagram emerges. I've left one of the actors out that Travis talked about, and that's really that user. I'm assuming that the user is actually running the API client at this point. But the API client sends a request to an authorization server for an access token. The authorization server, in essence, facilitates the authentication, and in this case, the assumption is that the API client has actually gathered credentials, so username and password already. It's a typical native mobile application. You know, when you see that authentication screen pop up, you enter your username and your password. That API client, that native mobile application, takes that and sends it off to an authorization server for authentication, and ultimately, it gets this request that goes back to the user that says, hey, this native mobile application is requesting to access this kind of information and to have this capability. And that's really where you authorize the scope that native mobile application can have. Of course, you grant that scope, or you grant that client access to that scope, and as a return, you get an access token. From that point on, the API client forgets the username and password. Now it just uses and stores that access token, and it sends, every time it interacts with an API, it sends that access token. When the API gets the access token, it validates it back with the authorization server. The authorization server says, yes, this is a valid access token, and then the API returns information. Now, there's a number of things that you can do in there that I've left out. One is, if, for example, you lose your phone. This phone has this access token stored. And so you, as the owner of that phone, you actually want to prevent whoever picks your phone up or who's ever stolen your phone from accessing that API on your behalf. So you can go in and you can actually cancel or invalidate the access token. And so then, the next time that API is accessed with the access token, and that validation call is made, it will return that access token is no longer good, and it actually restarts that authentication flow. And so OAuth is really good for those mobile use cases where you can lose control of your clients. And so you can go in and help secure yourself by invalidating the access tokens. So then we move into SAML. Like I said with SAML, that's all about authentication. It's all about federation. And really what that is enabling the identification of users across domains or across organizations. And so if we go back to that neighbor example, like you have a house, you have a family that can go into the house. Your neighbors also have a house. And luckily, because they're your neighbors, you probably trust them. And so you've established this trusted relationship. And based on that, you say, hey, anybody within your house can also come in and do certain things within my house. And maybe I'll give you a key, and anybody within that house can go and get the key and come and access. It's basically the same thing, is that the first thing you have to do is establish trust between the organizations. And that's usually done with SAML. It's done with exchanging certificates, and then also exchanging some metadata. And so basically the metadata describes what kind of identity information will be used to transfer from the identity provider, from your neighbor's house, into your house, the service provider. And then, of course, once you've done that, once you've established this connection, in essence, you have signed and encrypted tokens that will be transferred back and forth that represent an identity. So the nice thing is you can actually layer SAML on top of OAuth. And so you get your authentication brokered by SAML. You can go out to your neighbor's house and identify who the user is. You get a SAML assertion or a SAML token that comes in. That gets exchanged for an OAuth access token, and then you can step through kind of the same OAuth flows as well, and that access token can be used to access APIs. Now the great thing about this is you actually haven't moved identities anywhere. All you're doing is moving some identity information from one organization to another, but the identities are still securely maintained where they're supposed to live. So of course, back to the swim lane diagrams. And what you're going to see is the lower half of this is really the same thing that you saw with OAuth. And so it really is kind of this layering effect. The top part of it is the SAML flow. And again, the API client requests an access token from the authorization server. The authorization server sees that this is coming from, this is a request from your neighbor, and says, okay, wait, I need to redirect you as a neighbor back to where your identities live. So we're going to go back to your neighbor's house. You're going to authenticate at your neighbor's house however you see fit. That's actually configured by your neighbor. So you can move beyond just usernames and passwords. You can start to go into strong authentication methods, whatever is necessary at that neighbor's house. Ultimately, you get what's called a SAML assertion back in, and then that SAML assertion is exchanged for the OAuth access token, and then again, you step into the OAuth flows. Just make sure. So that brings us into OpenID Connect. And like I mentioned earlier, OpenID Connect is really the combination of the two. I call it the new kid on the block. It was just recently ratified as a standard. But it really started off with the OAuth 2 specification. And then it took the identity capabilities and the federation capabilities of SAML and laid those on top of the OAuth 2 specification. And so as a result of that, you now have OAuth 2 at the center, and this identity layer that sits on top of the OAuth 2 specification. So if you start, I spent a lot of time talking about tokens because really that's the world that we live in is tokens. I don't want to necessarily use username and passwords anymore. I want to get everything into a token. So again, OpenID Connect has a token. And that token is actually a concatenation of two things. It's a concatenation of the OAuth access token that we've been talking about all along. But now it's added this identity token in as well. It's called the JSON Web Token. And what it is it's just a secure identity container. It can be signed and encrypted. And it contains information about that user that goes along with the access token. So it has the same trust model that we talked about with SAML. But there's some benefits there. They've actually worked to simplify how identity providers and service providers actually can connect. There's no longer this very manual dance of exchanging certificates and metadata. They've worked to automate quite a bit of that. And as a result, you have lower maintenance. One of the big challenges with SAML is that every year your certificates expire. And so every year you have to go back to your partner, go back to your customer, and go through the certificate dance where you exchange certificates with each other and update your systems. And you have to do them together. They have to be coordinated, or else suddenly all of your users can't authenticate into the service. OpenID Connect actually solves a lot of that with some public endpoints where you can go and get the public signing keys. As a service provider, I can go and get the public signing keys for the identity provider, and then use those to validate the identity tokens that are being sent into me. So as a result, you can actually rotate your keys a lot more often, and it actually helps increase security. So again, back to the swim lanes. I know these are exciting, aren't they? These actually look really similar to that combination of SAML and OAuth. In that native mobile application, that OAuth client, requests an OpenID Connect token. And it's going, in essence, to an authorization server. I've called it an OpenID Connect server in this case. The OpenID Connect server says, you're a user that's coming in from outside of my organization. I'm going to issue that redirect. I'm going to send you down to the identity provider. In OpenID Connect, they're called a little bit different. They're called relying parties. No, they're OpenID Connect providers, excuse me. So you get redirected down to the OpenID Connect provider. Again, you go through the authentication flow that's configured at that provider, and as a result, you get an OpenID Connect token that comes back down to the device. At that point, that native mobile application can actually start to use that OpenID Connect token to call APIs. And so the nice thing here is there isn't that token exchange that we saw before, where you had to go and send your SAML assertion to somewhere so that you can get that OAuth access token. You can actually start using that OpenID Connect token immediately. So of course, you request data from an API using your OpenID Connect token. When that resource goes to validate the token, it actually calls back into the OpenID Connect server. The OpenID Connect server can validate the token all the way back down with the identity provider that issued it. And so it's no longer necessarily that source of record. It doesn't have to maintain information about that token specifically. It can reach back to where that token originated and validate it. The nice thing again is when that mobile app or mobile device gets lost, you can go as that user, you can call one place and say, hey, I lost my phone, I need to terminate all of my tokens. And so you don't have to call into specific service providers and say, hey, I lost my phone, terminate this token. It's really done in one place, and so it starts to centralize the administration of tokens into one place. Of course, you get a validation response back to the OpenID Connect server. That gets propagated to the API, and the API returns information. So what does this look like to architect? Again, so I've spent a little bit of time in marketing. So I've got to say these are marketing diagrams. They're very high level. If you want to dive into details, come and find me. I've actually spent some time, looking at this technically and working on this technically. So we can certainly dive into details. Of course, you start with your API and your client. Typically, you would add OAuth 2 in there, and as a part of that, that typically means you get a directory, that you're going to have a local directory that you're going to maintain users. Of course, when you get that big customer that has all of their users off in their directory, that's going to require federation, and that's typically going to be SAML. And that will get you connected out to their directory so you don't have to start to import all of their users. Of course, the last option is just to start with OpenID Connect. Which brings up the question of which one is the best option. There are actually pluses and minuses to both. Because OpenID Connect is really targeted for these use cases, it's got more pluses. Its downside right now, though, is that because it was just ratified, because it's a new standard, it's actually really limited adoption within the industry. We're spending a lot of time talking about it because we do feel it's actually the right thing to do, but that adoption just isn't as widely adopted as SAML is right now. So again, like I said, I'm a product manager. I've got to push product. We have two of them. The first one is Ping Federate. The nice thing about Ping Federate is it actually does all of these standards, and so you can start to select the right standard for the right use case. So if you have a partner that speaks SAML, you can connect with SAML. If you have a partner that speaks OpenID Connect, you can connect with OpenID Connect. We also have what we call Ping Access that is really around that authorization, so being able to determine what users can do within your APIs, as well as providing that auditing layer so that when it comes time to record and report on what your users are doing, it has that capability as well. Are there any questions? That's all I've got. If you want to talk about this more, certainly find me at the break. I can talk about this for hours.